Xi Jinping visited Saudi Arabia on December 9th. The purpose of his visit was reportedly to persuade the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to abandon the United States as an ally and join China's plan to abolish the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. This visit and many others proved to be part of his CCP's plan to become the most powerful superpower in the world. The only way for the CCP to achieve this goal is to dethrone the dollar as the world's most powerful currency. So let me explain why the CCP hates dollar power and its plans to take it away. To understand why the dollar is so powerful, you have to go back a bit and look back at how the dollar became the world's reserve currency. Before World War I, the reserve currency was the British pound. It was the currency of the world because it was the strongest economy and the most gold. However, World War I and World War II devastated the British economy and the economies of most European countries. Meanwhile, the U.S. economy experienced massive growth during this period and was able to accumulate large amounts of gold. At one point after World War II, the United States held more than 3/4 of the world's gold reserves. This gave the U.S. government great influence. So the government used this leverage to bring all the major nations together at the Bretton Woods Conference, many of which agreed to peg their currencies to the US dollar. The US dollar was then pegged to gold. Many people are now pointing to this event in history, claiming that the US dollar took advantage of other countries that were struggling economically after the two world wars to gain status as the world's reserve currency. I mean, that's not true at all, is it? Let me explain. These countries were not forced to sign the Bretton Woods Agreement. No, they signed this contract in their best interest. The U.S. had the strongest economy, meaning it was the most stable. As a result, countries felt very comfortable pegging their currencies to the U.S. dollar. Once countries pegged their currencies to the dollar, the stability that came with it made it easier for businesses to transact across borders. As a result, it helped these countries rebuild more quickly after the war. In addition, the Bretton Woods Agreement also created the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank. The IMF's job is to monitor the exchange rates of all currencies and ensure that countries remain pegged to the US dollar. Meanwhile, the World Bank lent money to countries to support post-war reconstruction efforts. As you can see, the United States played a major role in helping countries recover from world wars. That's why these countries accepted the Bretton Woods Agreement. Today, the agreement is best suited to help countries recover from war, and some of Bretton Woods' infrastructure survives today. As we started investing, it became clear that this peg to gold was unsustainable in the long term. For this reason, U.S. President Richard Nixon temporarily suspended the exchange of dollars for gold in 1971. And that suspension was never lifted, pulling the dollar off the gold standard. Properly protect the position of the US dollar as a pillar of financial stability around the world. I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the necessary actions to protect the dollar. I have instructed Secretary of State Conley to temporarily suspend the conversion of dollar into gold or other foreign exchange reserves. At present, the United States was still the strongest economy. However, for the US dollar to remain the world's reserve currency, there must be a large demand for it, so that the market price always has a fair value. Otherwise, the price will fluctuate greatly with each large transaction, further complicating international trading. So instead of creating demand for gold, the US government decided to create oil demand. In the modern economy, some things can be argued to be more valuable than gold. Traces of black gold and the value of oil have attracted British oil investors to the remote barren-pored mountains. The pioneers could not be deterred. During World War II, oil demand soared and resources became a major international issue. At the end of the war, the United States allied with Saudi Arabia, guaranteeing the country's security in exchange for privileged access to oil. Oil is the world's most coveted commodity, and its uses seem endless. World oil consumption is increasing significantly. Most oils were purchased in dollars. This means that their countries must buy and hold it in reserve so they can always buy oil for their citizens. The dollar is the largest foreign exchange reserve held by countries around the world. This has benefits for the United States. First, let's move on to the second part of the Saudi-US deal that hit the economy hard when the Saudis agreed to sell oil in US dollars. They also agreed on something else that I don't think others paid much attention to, but I think it's just as important. The Saudi royal family agreed to keep excess profits from oil sales on U.S. treasuries, and slowly, most countries, not just Saudi Arabia, kept excess reserves and U.S. treasuries. This is because the deal between Saudi Arabia and the United States has not only increased the demand for dollars, it has also increased the demand for U.S. treasuries, and this high demand has made it easier for the U.S. government to borrow at any time. The dollar is the most stable currency because there is so much demand for it. This has led to the introduction of more and more countries into the trade. But if the countries such as Iran, North Korea, or Russia becomes too unfriendly with the United States can simply impose sanctions on them and cut them off from the global financial system. In addition, many countries hold most of the reserves in U.S. treasuries, allowing the U.S. to freeze their reserves, as Russia did after it invaded Ukraine. The power of the U.S. dollar is so far-reaching that all banks in every corner of the world must follow U.S. rules if they want to stay in the financial sector. The dollar as a reserve currency is more profitable domestically and has great influence over governments internationally. Well, that's the kind of power China wants to wield for its own sake, allowing it to expand its power and influence even more quickly. I'm not very happy to have such power over my country. As such, China is seeking to promote trading its currency, the yuan, to gain more influence on the world stage following Western sanctions against Russia. With China and Russia primarily, I Am Trading with China is also using loans to developing countries to force them to use the yuan for trade. I have covered extensively how the CCP uses shark loans to developing countries to gain power over them. China uses the same leverage to increase its use of the yuan. China is demanding that countries repay their loans in renminbi. With more than 140 countries currently participating in China's Belt and Road Initiative, this will be effective if successful. If everyone agrees to use more yuan, it could increase the stability of the currency. China is also the world's largest exporter, meaning that countries buy goods from China. If the CCP can persuade even a handful of these countries to switch on trade, it could have a big impact on the dollar's standing. When Chinese President Xi Jinping arrived in Saudi Arabia on Wednesday, what was his agenda? To break U.S.'s long-standing dominance in the region. China also plans to use the Shanghai Oil and Gas Exchange as a platform for making Iranian oil and gas trade settlements. It was his first visit to the kingdom in 6 years, and the two countries reaffirmed their ties and made many strategic deals. That is what Xi Jinping hopes to achieve with his visit to Saudi Arabia. Relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia have been a little rocky lately. President Biden visited the Crown Prince and confirmed that OPEC will not cut oil production in order to drive up oil prices. The trip seemed to be going well, but OPEC suddenly announced major cuts in oil production just before the midterm elections. That's because Saudi Arabia isn't too happy about the U.S. pulling out of Afghanistan, becoming too friendly with Iran, and a host of other issues. It'll result in Saudi Arabia cutting oil production at an appropriate time, he argued. Talk of the NOPEC law passage also touched on where the U.S. could sue OPEC cartel, oil-producing leaders. Of course, the Saudis were not happy with this at all, so they came up with the idea of selling oil in a currency other than dollars. This is where Xi Jinping comes into play. Saudi Arabia has previously expressed interest in accepting the yuan instead of the dollar. If Xi Jinping can convince them, it could be a big business in China's efforts to dismantle dollar power. I know you're wondering if Xi Jinping will succeed. Does that mean China will have the world's new reserve currency? Let me explain that many nations are resentful that we rightfully have so much power over them. Is not? No. They don't want another country to rule them. In other words, think of it as human nature to feel uncomfortable when someone else controls your future too much. Here it is. So hypothetically, let's assume that all countries will switch to yuan. That's not going to solve anything. We don't have all that power now. China will have it, and most countries have more power than China. The Chinese Communist Party has a long history of manipulating its currency, punishing countries that question its actions, and generally keeping its plans unclear. It's unlikely that the dollar will be replaced as a key currency. And even if that were the case, there would be a high probability that a large number of currencies would replace the renminbi and replace the dollar.